He was buried alive. The elephant's reaction after saving him will leave you speechless. The African sun beat down mercilessly as I made my way through the Mara Conservancy in Kenya, camera in hand, hoping to capture the perfect wildlife shot for National Geographic's upcoming issue. My name is Marcus Wright, a wildlife photographer with 15 years of experience documenting animals in their natural habitats. I've tracked polar bears across Arctic ice, swam with great white sharks off South Africa's coast, and spent months in the Amazon rainforest photographing elusive jaguars. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I was about to witness that sweltering afternoon in May. I had been following a herd of elephants for nearly 2 weeks, a magnificent group consisting of 2 adult males, 6 females, and 4 calves. My assignment was to document their family dynamics, feeding patterns, and the challenges they faced in an ecosystem increasingly pressured by human encroachment. The dominant male, whom the local guides had named Tembo, was particularly impressive. A 6-year-old elephant in his prime with a magnificent pair of tusks and a distinctive scar across his right flank from a territorial dispute years earlier. The day I had set out before dawn with my guide, a native Maasai with an uncanny ability to track wildlife and an encyclopedic knowledge of animal behavior. We had located the herd near a watering hole and spent the morning photographing their interactions. By midday, most of the elephants had settled into the shade for their typical afternoon rest. But Tembo seemed unusually alert, his ears perked up, his attention focused on something in the distance. "He hears something we cannot," Karuki whispered, his experienced eyes scanning the horizon. "Perhaps a distressed animal." We decided to follow at a safe distance as Tembo rose and began moving purposefully through the tall grass. Elephants typically feed in the cool hours of dawn and dusk, so this midday activity was unusual enough to pique our professional curiosity. After about 20 minutes, Tembo froze, his powerful body tensing as he lowered his head and scanned the area with his trunk. "Strange," Keon muttered. "There is no prey animal I can see." Through my telephoto lens, I scanned the area ahead, expecting to spot a gazelle or perhaps a young wildebeest separated from its herd. Instead, what came into focus sent a chill down my spine despite the oppressive heat. Partially hidden in the grass about 50 yards ahead was what appeared to be a shallow grave with a human hand protruding from the disturbed earth. "My God," I gasped, lowering my camera. "Keone, look, there's someone buried there." Keone followed my gaze, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm. "We must help," he said immediately, but then hesitated, his eyes darting back to Tembo, who was now moving slowly toward the grave. But the elephant! We were faced with an impossible dilemma. Someone was possibly still alive, buried in that shallow grave. But between them and us was one of nature's most powerful herbivores, a 12,000-pound animal capable of knocking down trees. Our vehicle was parked nearly a kilometer back, where the terrain had become too rough to continue. "Call for backup on the radio," I urged Kay, never taking my eyes off Tembo and the police. "We need to document this." As Kay made the calls, I continued photographing the unfolding scene, my professional instincts taking over despite the horror of the situation. What happened next defied everything I thought I knew about elephant behavior. Tembo approached the grave cautiously, his trunk flaring as he caught the scent of human. But instead of displaying the aggressive behavior one might expect, he began to gently prod at the loose soil around the exposed hand with his trunk. It was almost as if he understood that something was wrong within this picture, that whatever lay beneath the soil didn't belong there. After a few minutes of careful digging, the elephant had exposed more of what was clearly a human arm. Then, incredibly, the fingers twitched. "They're alive," I breathed, hardly believing what I was seeing. "Whoever is buried there is still alive." The movement seemed to further intrigue Tembo, who continued his careful excavation, using his massive trunk with surprising delicacy to move the soil away from what was now revealed to be a man's arm and shoulder. The incongruity was mind-boggling. One of Africa's most massive creatures, apparently working to unearth a buried human. About 15 minutes into this extraordinary scene, we heard the distant sound of vehicles approaching, the backup Kay had called for. The noise didn't deter Tembo, who had now exposed the upper torso and head of a man maybe in his 30s, with clear signs of beating and trauma visible, even from our position. As the vehicles drew closer, I expected Tembo to flee, as elephants typically avoid human commotion. Instead, he continued his efforts until the man's entire upper body was free from the soil. Only when the first vehicle, a Land Rover carrying 3 Conservancy Rangers, came into view, did Tembo finally retreat, though not in panic. He moved back about 30 yards and watched as the Rangers approached, weapons ready but not aimed directly at the elephant. "Don't shoot," I called out as we approached from our position. The elephant was helping him. The Rangers looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but they held their fire as they rushed to the half-buried man. He was alive, but barely, dehydrated, beaten, and clearly left for dead by whoever had put him there. As the Rangers radioed for medical evacuation and began administering first aid, Tembo remained in his position, watching the proceedings with what I can only describe as intent interest. More vehicles arrived: police, medical personnel, and additional Rangers. Throughout the commotion, Tembo maintained his vigil, retreating only slightly when approached too closely, but refusing to leave the scene entirely. It was behavior so atypical that even Kion, with his decades of experience, was left shaking his head in disbelief. "In all my years," he said quietly, "I have never seen anything like this." It is as if he knew this man needed help. The injured man was carefully extracted from the grave and placed on a stretcher. As they carried him to the medical vehicle, his eyes flickered open briefly, and through cracked lips, he whispered something that only the nearest medic could hear. The medic looked startled, then glanced back at Tembo with an expression of disbelief. Later, we would learn that the man's name was David Karuki, a Kenyan environmental activist who had been investigating reports of illegal poaching activities in the region. He had been ambushed 3 days earlier, beaten severely, and left to die in that shallow grave, a warning to others who might interfere with the lucrative illegal wildlife trade. But the truly extraordinary part of the story was only beginning to unfold. As David was driven away for urgent medical care, Tembo did something that defied explanation. He began to follow the vehicle, maintaining a steady pace behind it until they reached the main road nearly a kilometer away. "He is coming with us to the hospital," one of the Rangers joked nervously, but there was an undercurrent of awe in his voice. Of course, once the vehicles picked up speed on the main road, Tembo could not keep up and eventually turned back toward his territory. But the connection that had been formed between the elephant and the man he had helped save would prove to be far from over. In fact, it was just the beginning of a relationship that would challenge our understanding of animal behavior and consciousness in ways none of us could have imagined. As I reviewed my photographs that evening, documenting this incredible encounter frame by frame, I knew I had witnessed something unprecedented. What I didn't know was that the story of Tembo and David would continue to unfold in ways that would leave the scientific community struggling for explanations, and that I would find myself following this extraordinary narrative for years to come. The story of the elephant who saved a buried man spread rapidly through Kenya's conservation community, and then exploded internationally when my photographs were published. Within days, media outlets from around the world were contacting me for interviews, and wildlife behavior experts were debating the significance of what I had captured. Some dismissed it as coincidence. The elephant was simply curious about something unusual in his territory. Others suggested more complex explanations involving scent recognition or even rudimentary empathy. What no one could deny was the extraordinary nature of the encounter. 3 weeks after the incident, I received a call from Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a renowned animal cognition researcher from the University of California. She had seen my photographs and read my account in National Geographic. "I'm coming to Kenya," she said without preamble. "This case could be groundbreaking for our understanding of elephant cognition. Can you connect me with the Conservancy?" Meanwhile, David Karuki was recovering in a Nairobi hospital. His injuries had been severe: multiple fractures, internal bleeding, dehydration, and trauma consistent with a brutal beating. According to the doctors, had he remained buried for another day, he would certainly have died. The police investigation into his attack was ongoing, with evidence pointing to a sophisticated poaching syndicate with connections to illegal wildlife trafficking across East Africa. I visited David about a month after his rescue. He was still bedridden, but alert and remarkably spirited, given what he had endured. When I introduced myself as the photographer who had documented his rescue, his eyes lit up with recognition. "The Elephant Man," he said with a weak smile. "I've been hoping to meet you." "How much do you remember?" I asked, pulling up a chair beside his bed. "Fragments," he admitted. "I was investigating reports of rhino horn trafficking near the Conservancy. Someone must have tipped off the poachers. They ambushed me on a remote road." His expression darkened. 3 men. They questioned me about what I knew, who I had told. When I wouldn't give them names of my sources, they beat me. Eventually, I lost consciousness. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window. I woke up being dragged. They were laughing, saying the animals would finish me off if the lack of water didn't. They threw me in a hole and started covering me with dirt. I tried to fight, but I couldn't move. He swallowed hard at the memory. I passed out again. The next thing I remember is feeling something digging near my hand. I thought it was them coming back, or maybe a scavenger animal. "It was Tembo," I said. "The elephant. Tembo." He repeated the name softly. "They told me about him in the hospital, that he found me, dug me out." David's eyes met mine, searching. "Is it true what they're saying? That he protected me until help came?" I showed him some of the photographs on my camera. Tembo carefully excavating the grave, standing guard as the rangers worked, following the medical vehicle. David studied each image with an intensity that suggested he was trying to piece together missing parts of his own story. "The medic said you whispered something when they were putting you in the vehicle," I ventured about the elephant. David was quiet for a long moment. "I remember gray skin and a trunk and large ears flapping over me. I thought I was hallucinating, or that it was a death vision." He shook his head slightly. "In our traditions, elephants are powerful symbols, guardians, protectors." He looked back at the photographs there. I never expected to experience that so literally. Over the next few months, as David continued his recovery and the investigation into the poaching ring progressed, Dr. Mitchell established a research project in the Conservancy with the primary goal of studying Tembo and his herd. I found myself dividing my time between documenting her work and following the legal case against the men who had attacked David. 3 suspects had been arrested based on evidence gathered from the crime scene and David's testimony. 6 months after the rescue, David was well enough to return to the Conservancy headquarters for a debriefing with the rangers and research team. The Conservancy director had invited me to document the meeting, which would include updates on both the anti-poaching efforts and Dr. Mitchell's findings regarding Tembo. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of professional focus and undeniable curiosity about the connection between the man and the elephant. But Dr. Mitchell presented her preliminary observations first, her academic tone belied by the excitement in her eyes. "Tembo's behavior has shown several anomalies since the incident," she explained, displaying graphs of movement patterns and territory marking. "He's extended his range to include the area where Mr. Karuki was found, even though it's not optimal elephant habitat. He's also shown unusual interest in Conservancy vehicles, approaching rather than avoiding them as most wild elephants would." She clicked to a new slide showing a map of GPS tracking data. "Most notably, on 3 separate occasions, he's traveled to within viewing distance of the main road where the medical transport last traveled, almost as if he's looking for something or someone." The room fell silent as the implications of her observations sank in. The scientists and rangers exchanged glances that mixed professional skepticism with grudging wonder. "Are you suggesting the elephant is looking for me?" David asked, his voice carefully neutral. Dr. Mitchell chose her words with scientific precision. "I'm suggesting that your encounter may have created a point of imprinting or interest that continues to influence his behavior patterns. Whether that constitutes looking for you in any cognitive sense is beyond what we can currently prove." The Conservancy director, a pragmatic woman named Grace Mwangi, who had dedicated her career to balancing wildlife preservation with human safety, leaned forward. "The question that becomes what we do with this information, Mr. Karuki. You have expressed interest in returning to your anti-poaching work. Dr. Mitchell is requesting extended research access to study Tembo. Meanwhile, we have a potentially habituated elephant showing unusual interest in human activity, which raises safety concerns." As the discussion continued, I noticed David growing increasingly quiet, his gaze drifting to the window that overlooked the savannah. Finally, he spoke up, interrupting a technical debate between 2 rangers. "I would like to see him," he said simply. The room fell silent again. Absolutely not, Grace said immediately. You've had a remarkable experience, Mr. Karuki, but Tembo is still a wild animal. We cannot sanction putting you in proximity to an elephant, regardless of your shared history. I understand the risks, David replied calmly, but I also understand that my work and his existence are connected by the same threat. The poachers who tried to kill me are the same ones who would target him for his tusks or the calves in his herd for the illegal wildlife trade. Dr. Mitchell was watching David with intense interest. What exactly are you proposing? A controlled meeting, he said, with proper safety measures, of course. Your research team could observe. It could provide valuable data for your study. Grace was already shaking her head, but Dr. Mitchell raised a hand. Surely, from a research perspective, this could be extraordinarily valuable. We could set up a secure observation vehicle, maintain a safe distance, and document the interaction. It would be unprecedented. It would be reckless, Grace countered. As the debate intensified, I found myself studying David's face. There was something in his expression, a certainty, a connection to this situation that went beyond scientific curiosity or even gratitude toward the animal that had saved him. It was as if he felt an obligation, a calling that he couldn't quite articulate in this room full of scientists and conservationists. Later, as we walked back to the guest quarters, I asked him about it directly. Why is seeing Tembo again so important to you? This goes beyond research or even closure, doesn't it? David paused, looking out over the landscape where somewhere Tembo was roaming with his herd. In my culture, we believe that a life saved creates a bond, a responsibility between the rescuer and the rescued, he said finally. I owe him a debt, and somehow I think he knows that. The next morning, against Grace's better judgment, but with Dr. Mitchell's enthusiastic support, preparations began for what would become one of the most extraordinary human-wildlife encounters ever documented, and one that would challenge fundamental assumptions about animal consciousness, memory, and the complex relationships between species that share our planet. Dawn broke over the Conservancy with the soft golden light that makes the African savanna seem almost ethereal. I had been up since 4 a.m., checking and rechecking my camera equipment. Today would be historic, either as a groundbreaking moment in our understanding of animal cognition or as a sobering reminder of the unbridgeable gap between humans and wild animals. Either way, I was determined to document every moment. The meeting location had been carefully selected based on Tembo's recent territory patterns, a small clearing near a watering hole where the herd had been observed regularly. 3 specially modified vehicles formed our observation post. One containing David and Dr. Mitchell behind reinforced glass, another with Grace, myself, and 2 rangers with tranquilizer guns, and a third positioned as an emergency evacuation vehicle if needed. David sat calmly in the lead vehicle, dressed in the same color shirt he had been wearing when rescued. A detail Dr. Mitchell had insisted upon to maximize recognition potential. Safety protocols had been rehearsed repeatedly, with Grace making it clear that at the first sign of aggressive behavior from Tembo, the encounter would be terminated immediately. The waiting was excruciating. 2 hours passed with no sign of the herd. The sun climbed higher and sweat beaded on foreheads inside the vehicles despite the air conditioning. Dr. Mitchell maintained a running commentary into her recorder, noting environmental conditions, scent factors, and behavioral predictions. David remained silent, his gaze fixed on the landscape, apparently lost in thoughts I could only guess at. Then, just as some of the team were beginning to suggest we might need to postpone, movement appeared at the edge of the clearing. Through my telephoto lens, I saw them, 2 of the female elephants emerging cautiously from the tall grass, followed by the calves. They moved toward the watering hole, alert but apparently unconcerned by our vehicles, which were common enough in the Conservancy not to trigger immediate alarm. "Where's Tembo, Doctor?" Mitchell whispered into her recorder, scanning the tree line. "The herd is here, but the dominant male is not with them." Another 20 minutes passed as the female elephants and calves drank and rested near the water. Still no sign of Tembo. David had not moved or spoken, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the intensity of his focus. Then, without warning, there he was, not emerging from the same direction as the herd, but from behind our vehicles. Somehow, Tembo had circled around and approached from downwind, a tactic that sent a chill down my spine despite our supposedly secure position. Through my camera, I captured the moment he appeared, his magnificent tusks backlit by the sun, his pace deliberate and focused. "He's approaching from the rear," Grace said tensely into her radio. "All vehicles be alert. Trank teams ready." Tembo paid no attention to the second and third vehicles. His focus was entirely on the lead vehicle where David sat. He approached slowly, not with aggression, but with a direct intentionality that was unmistakable. When he was approximately 15 meters from David's vehicle, he stopped. His trunk flared as he scented the air. Dr. Mitchell was whispering rapid observations into her recorder, her scientific detachment beginning to fray at the edges as the enormous animal fixed his gaze directly on their position. Inside the lead vehicle, David made a decision. Before anyone could stop him, he pressed the button to lower the window. Not completely, but enough to allow his scent to flow more freely toward the elephant. "What is he doing?" Grace hissed in alarm. "That wasn't in the protocol." Through my lens, I saw Dr. Mitchell reaching for the window control, but David gently blocked her hand. His expression was calm, resolved. He knew what he was doing. Tembo's reaction was immediate. His head came up sharply, ears forward, as the scent reached him. He took several steps closer, now just 10 meters from the vehicle. Close enough that David could clearly see the intelligent, deep-set eyes that had looked into his when he was half-conscious in that shallow grave. What happened next would be analyzed, debated, and studied for years to come. Tembo moved to the side of the vehicle where David sat, and then did something extraordinary. He curled his trunk and lowered his head, not in a defensive posture, but in a way that almost resembled a bow, his massive body dipping toward the ground. Then he looked up directly at David, a long, steady gaze that seemed to contain recognition. In the lead vehicle, David made another unplanned move. He began to speak, his voice carrying softly through the partially open window. "Thank you," he said simply in Swahili. "Thank you for finding me." Tembo remained motionless, his eyes fixed on David. For nearly 10 minutes they remained in this tableau, the man speaking quietly, the elephant listening with an attentiveness that defied conventional understanding of animal behavior. I photographed every moment, hardly daring to breathe. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Tembo rose. He circled the vehicle once, brushing so close to the side that I could see David's hand trembling as he resisted the impossible urge to reach out and touch the massive creature. Then, with a last look at David, Tembo turned and walked unhurriedly toward his herd at the watering hole. The radios crackled with relieved voices, scientific observations, and expressions of disbelief. But in the lead vehicle, David and Dr. Mitchell sat in stunned silence, witnesses to something that transcended easy explanation. The encounter lasted less than 20 minutes, but its impact was seismic. Dr. Mitchell's research paper, published 18 months later in the journal Nature, would challenge fundamental assumptions about animal cognition, memory, and interspecies recognition. My photographs would win a Pulitzer and be featured in museums around the world. But more importantly, the story of Tembo and David would become a rallying point for conservation efforts across Africa. The poaching syndicate that had attacked David was eventually dismantled through a coordinated international effort, prompted in part by the publicity surrounding his case. David himself became a prominent voice in wildlife protection, establishing a foundation dedicated to community-based conservation initiatives that engaged local populations in protecting their natural heritage. As for Tembo, he continued to thrive in the Conservancy with his herd, fathering multiple calves over the years. The research team noted that he maintained an unusual tolerance for vehicles and the scent of humans, though he never again approached as directly as he had during that arranged meeting. He seemed to have closed a circle, acknowledged a connection, and then returned fully to his wild nature. 5 years after the rescue, I found myself back in the Conservancy for the opening of a new anti-poaching headquarters funded in part by David's foundation. After the ceremony, David and I drove out to a ridgeline overlooking the territory where Tembo's herd was now known to roam. "Do you ever think about why he did it?" I asked as we watched the sunset paint the savanna in shades of gold and amber. "Why he stopped to dig you out when any other elephant would have just continued on his way?" David was quiet for a long moment. Scientists have their theories: curiosity, unusual scent patterns, disrupted territory markers. He smiled slightly. But sometimes I think it was simpler than that. Perhaps for just a moment, the line between wild animal and human didn't matter. He saw a living thing in distress, and he responded. As if summoned by our conversation, a distant trumpeting rolled across the landscape, the unmistakable sound of a dominant male elephant claiming his territory as darkness approached. Whether it was Tembo or another elephant was impossible to tell, but David turned toward the sound, a look of profound respect on his face. "We share this world with remarkable creatures," he said quietly. "Most of the time, we're too busy seeing them as either threats or resources to recognize that they have inner lives as complex and meaningful as our own." Tembo reminded me of that truth when he pulled me from the grave. As we drove back to the Conservancy headquarters in the gathering dusk, I reflected on how a single moment of unexpected connection between species had rippled outward, affecting not just the lives of those directly involved, but conservation efforts across a continent. The story of the elephant who saved a buried man had become something more than a viral sensation or scientific curiosity. It had become a parable for our time, a reminder that compassion can emerge in the most unlikely places, even from those we have been taught to fear. And somewhere in the darkness of the African night, Tembo continued his elephant's life, unaware of his role in this larger story, but forever connected to it. The animal who for one extraordinary moment had chosen to save rather than ignore, and in doing so had revealed something profound about the nature of life itself.